What if we told you that Africa is done being the West's playground? What if one nation's bold decision to demand the removal of foreign military bases could set off a chain reaction that rattles the very core of global power dynamics? That's exactly what Senegal's president Bassaru Faye did. He demanded French troops pack their bags and leave. But this isn't just a protest about military presence. It's a declaration of independence from colonial legacies that still haunt Africa today. You're probably thinking, it's just one country. Think again. This could be the spark that ignites a continent-wide transformation. Senegal isn't just telling France to get out, it's sending a message to every former colonial power that Africa isn't a playground for their exploitation anymore. But is it that big of a deal? Let's find out. Let's rewind the clock a bit and take a look at the context. Why did President Bassaru Faye choose this precise moment to demand that France, once a colonial overlord, pack up its military bases and leave Senegal? On the surface, it might seem like a simple political move. But beneath that is a far more complex, deeply personal, and historically charged decision that goes back decades, centuries. The year 2024 marks the 80th anniversary of one of Senegal's darkest chapters, the Thiaroye massacre of 1944. For many, it's a painful and still raw memory. During World War II, Senegalese soldiers, many of whom had fought valiantly for France and Europe, were promised compensation for their service. But when they returned home to Senegal, they were met not with gratitude, but with bullets. French soldiers gunned them down in cold blood after they demanded the pay they were promised. These soldiers, who had served France on foreign soil, were brutally murdered by the very power they had fought for, betrayed by the same colonial empire they had helped expand.
La nuit du 30 novembre au 1er décembre 1944, une nuit de honte, d'ingratitude, d'ignominie.
These words resound within the walls of Thiaroye's community centre. A young theatre group, The Voice of the Voiceless, is rehearsing its latest play, a tribute to the Senegalese infantry killed by the French army at the Thiaroye camp in 1944.
This wasn't just a singular act of violence. It was a clear demonstration of the extent to which France saw its African subjects as expendable, a group to be used for their benefit and discarded when no longer convenient. This massacre, which took place in the Thiaroye region of Senegal, remains one of the most significant yet underreported atrocities in colonial history. While it was brushed under the carpet for decades, it remains a symbol of the kind of systemic violence and exploitation that defined France's colonial rule over much of Africa. Now, fast forward to today. While Macron's apology for the Thiaroye massacre in 2014 was seen by some as an attempt to reconcile, it didn't sit well with many in Senegal. An apology is just words after all, especially when the mechanisms of colonial control remain firmly in place. France's military presence in Senegal is one of those very mechanisms. These foreign bases, stationed under the guise of security and cooperation, are a reminder that, despite the symbolic gestures, the French grip on Africa's political and military landscapes is far from loosened. Faye's decision to demand France's departure is not just political, it is deeply personal. Senegalese citizens have long felt the weight of this colonial legacy, not just through historical injustices, but through the tangible, everyday structures of foreign influence. For Faye, this demand represents more than a rejection of colonial power. It is a stand for justice. Faye is demanding that France finally acknowledge the true cost of its colonial rule, which didn't end when the flags came down and independence was declared in 1960. It's about justice that extends beyond the shallow apologies or reparations that are often offered as a quick fix to a much deeper issue. But this isn't just about confronting a single painful event from the past. It's about facing the ongoing effects of colonialism, the systemic structures that continue to affect African nations today. And in that, Faye's decision is not isolated to the Thiaroye massacre or the historic relationship between Senegal and France. It's part of a larger, more urgent conversation about the future of Africa as a whole. So, let's ask a bigger question. Why are foreign military bases so entrenched in Africa's geopolitical landscape? And why must they be removed for true African sovereignty? The French military presence in Senegal is not an isolated incident. It's a symbol of Africa's ongoing dependency on foreign powers. These military bases are not benign entities built to protect the nation. They represent the continued external control and influence over Africa's political, military, and economic decisions. The reality is that while Africa has officially been decolonized for decades, many African nations, especially in the Sahel and West Africa, are still tethered to their former colonizers by military presence and foreign bases.
As French people, could you imagine seeing us in your country with tanks or military vehicles, with Senegalese soldiers in Senegalese uniforms? That's what history has been like. France has enslaved, colonized, and remained.
Foreign military bases serve a dual purpose. They provide security and exert power. To many in Africa, these bases are viewed as the remnants of a colonial past that refuses to die. In countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the presence of French and other Western troops isn't just about combating insurgency or maintaining peace. It's about keeping African nations in a constant state of dependence. These military footprints allow Western powers to maintain their influence over Africa's resources, governance, and security, no matter what the narrative of aid or support might be. But here's where Faye's demand becomes much more than just symbolic. It's a direct challenge to this entire framework of foreign dominance. France's role in Senegal has been complicated for decades, particularly given the military ties. The presence of these military bases means that despite having independence, Senegal's sovereignty is still under siege. Faye's demand goes beyond removing foreign military personnel. It's about removing the lingering colonial structures that continue to dictate Africa's future. What Faye is essentially calling for is a complete rethinking of Africa's geopolitical relationships. Why is it that, after independence, African nations still allow foreign powers to station troops on their soil? Why do they still rely on foreign aid and military assistance rather than fostering self-sufficiency and solidarity among themselves? These questions go to the heart of the larger issue of neo-colonialism, where Africa is not just physically exploited, but politically and militarily manipulated by powers that continue to shape its destiny. For Faye, this is not merely a question of national pride. It's about Senegal's right to define its future, free from external interference. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The removal of foreign military bases in Senegal is a first step in breaking away from the historical patterns of dependence. The colonial systems may have been dismantled on paper, but in practice, these countries continue to be treated as extensions of foreign empires, where their resources and governance remain under the control of powers that once subjugated them. This is where Faye's decision hits hardest. It's not just a fight over military bases, it's a fight for the agency. It's about Senegal and Africa as a whole, saying, we have the right to control our destiny. We don't need foreign powers deciding what's best for us. By demanding France's military presence leave, Faye is challenging every African nation to take control of its sovereignty, not in words, but in actions. And why must Africa break free from this cycle? Because these military bases are a tool of control, a way for Western powers to keep their influence intact. As long as these bases remain on African soil, Africa is not truly free. The existence of foreign military bases is the clearest manifestation of Africa's neocolonial reality, where the continent's political decisions, military strategies, and even its borders are dictated by foreign powers. Faye's demand is about more than just removing foreign soldiers. It's about removing the ideological and institutional structures that have kept Africa in a state of subjugation for so long. Military presence is not just about security, it's about the power dynamics that come with it. Africa must be free to make its own decisions, define its alliances, and establish partnerships based on mutual respect, not military dominance. The stakes are high, and Faye is asking Africa to rise to the challenge. The removal of foreign military bases isn't just symbolic, It's an essential part of creating a truly independent Africa, one that is no longer a pawn in global geopolitics. It's about putting an end to a system that has kept Africa at the mercy of foreign interests for too long. And it's time for Africa to take control of its future. Here the important question is, how will France leave Africa? Is just ordering France to leave enough? The past decade has seen a remarkable shift in the way African nations view their relationship with the West, particularly France. African leaders, particularly those in the Sahel and West Africa, have grown increasingly frustrated with the role that foreign powers, especially France, have played in their internal affairs. This frustration has only intensified as the French-led operations, such as Operation Barkhane, designed to combat insurgency in the region, have not delivered the promised results. Instead of feeling protected, many African nations have begun to feel more like pawns in France's geopolitical game. This is where President Faye's demand becomes particularly powerful. It's not just about sending troops home. It's about reclaiming African sovereignty. Senegal, once a proud ally of France, is leading the charge in questioning France's role and rejecting the outdated colonial structures still in place. But it's not only Senegal. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have already taken steps to distance themselves from French influence, replacing France with more independent partnerships, such as those with Russia. This awakening of African self-determination is crucial in understanding why France's hold on Africa is becoming increasingly untenable. African nations are recognizing that they don't need to rely on their former colonizers for protection. They are no longer satisfied with hollow promises of security, especially when foreign military presence often exacerbates the very problems it claims to solve. The wind is changing, and countries are starting to realize that their future doesn't require France's constant interference. Also, France has long justified its military presence in Africa as necessary for securing French economic interests. The Sahel, for example, is rich in valuable resources like uranium and oil, resources that have been extracted and exported to France, often under deals that benefit French companies far more than the African nations that host these resources. But the world has changed. Africa's economy is diversifying, and it's no longer as reliant on French businesses. As China and other emerging powers continue to expand their investments in Africa, offering trade deals and infrastructure projects with fewer strings attached, the economic justification for France's intervention becomes weaker and weaker. Senegal's growing relationship with China is a clear example of this shift. China doesn't need military bases to build influence. It builds trade corridors, infrastructure, and economic ties that benefit both sides. France is losing its grip as Africa diversifies its relationships. African nations are increasingly looking to China, Russia, and even Turkey for economic partnerships that are based on mutual respect, not military dominance. This is causing France's once powerful influence to erode. The shift towards Chinese investment, in particular, poses a direct threat to France's economic interests in Africa, making its military presence feel more like an imposition than a necessity. And what about dealing with media control? In the age of social media and global connectivity, it's no longer possible for France to maintain its hold on African hearts and minds. The growing public sentiment in many African countries is overwhelmingly against France's role in their affairs. People see through the facade of peacekeeping missions when they see their country's resources being drained, their soldiers being killed in operations that don't benefit them, and their sovereignty being undermined. The masses, particularly in former French colonies, are waking up to the fact that their countries have been manipulated and not protected. French military operations have often resulted in the loss of life, civilian casualties, and destabilization, while France reaps the benefits in terms of resources, influence, and control. The population is now rising against this, with increasing protests and calls for the French military to leave. The voices on the streets in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are becoming louder and harder to ignore. This rising anti-Western sentiment is not only pushing governments to reconsider their relationships with France, but also giving them the political cover they need to act. For African leaders like Faye, rejecting French military presence has become a way to align with the growing public sentiment and reclaim their nation's sovereignty in a way that resonates with their people. The question now is, Can France remain in Africa when so many countries are saying no? The simple answer is no. France's position in Africa is increasingly untenable. As more African leaders grow bolder in rejecting French influence, the pressure will mount on France to withdraw. In a world where international relations are becoming more multipolar, France's days of being the puppet master in Africa are numbered. The international community is watching closely. While France has long enjoyed the support of Western allies, it's hard to ignore the growing political and economic power of African nations. African leaders are starting to realize they don't need to be beholden to former colonial powers anymore. Instead, they can build partnerships based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. This is where the real shift will occur. France may not be forced out by military confrontation, but by the political will of African nations to stand up and say, "We're done." As countries like Senegal lead the way, the dominoes will start to fall. France may try to hold on to its remaining influence with diplomacy, but if the people of Africa and their leaders continue to push back, the pressure will be too great. France's military bases may soon be a thing of the past, as African nations find their path to security, prosperity, and independence. Overall, what does an independent Africa signal to Western nations? When one African country, especially one as significant as Senegal, stands up and tells a former colonial power like France to pack up its military bases, the impact goes beyond the immediate geopolitical relationship between those two countries. It sends shockwaves throughout the entire African continent and challenges the broader framework of foreign military presence that has long been a staple of Western influence in Africa. And while France might be the first to feel the heat, the US, Britain, and other Western powers will soon find their military presence under increasing scrutiny. Why? The removal of France's military footprint in Africa could spark a domino effect, forcing other countries to rethink their strategies in a continent they've long treated as their playground. By forcing France to pack up and leave, Senegal's bold move could unravel the entire military infrastructure that has enabled the West to exert influence across the continent. If France, already struggling to maintain its military presence due to increasing local opposition and rising anti-colonial sentiment, is forced out, other Western powers will feel the pressure to follow suit. After all, they can't afford to be the last colonial holdouts in Africa, especially when African nations are demanding control over their futures. Now let's zoom in on the US, which has hundreds of military personnel scattered across Africa, many of whom operate in and around French bases. The U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, is a massive entity that has been involved in numerous military interventions, including operations in Libya, Somalia, and Niger. But the U.S. doesn't act alone in Africa. It relies heavily on French military infrastructure to carry out many of these operations. The U.S. military's dependence on French bases to operate in Africa is a sign that the U.S. is not as autonomous as it would like the world to believe. Many of the U.S. bases in Africa are located in countries that were once French colonies, such as Djibouti, where the U.S. shares space with French troops. These shared military operations are not just about securing African countries, they're about ensuring that Western nations retain a foothold in a region rich with natural resources and strategic importance. If France is forced to vacate its military bases in Africa, the U.S. will no longer have convenient access to these strategic locations. This could force the U.S. to either pull back from its operations or find other ways to exert influence in the region. The political pressure on the U.S. to justify its military presence without French support will become harder to ignore. So, Senegal's decision is just the beginning. Africa's future is no longer a passive narrative dictated by the West. The continent is rising. Will Africa rise fast enough to claim its rightful place in the world? Or will it continue to be pawed over by outside forces? Let us know in the comments section if France can gain back its control of Africa. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.